The woman just happened to glance out the window and noticed that the man in the opposite window seemed to be staring at her. At that moment, she didn't think much of it, assuming he was just relaxing in his free time. But the next evening, when she stood by the window again, she found that the figure had appeared once more. Juliet suddenly felt a tinge of unease. That whole night, she tossed and turned, unable to sleep, but she didn't tell her husband about it, only hoping he would install curtains at home soon. But the next day, when they went out for a walk, they discovered that something seemed to have happened in the apartment building at the street corner. However, the onlookers didn't know what had occurred. They only saw a man sitting dazedly in the ambulance. Just as Juliet looked at the man, he stared back at her intently. Juliet's heart almost jumped out of her chest, and she quickly left the scene with her husband. It wasn't until the next day that she learned from the news that a woman had been murdered the previous night, and the dazed man had discovered the body. This made Juliet suddenly a bit worried, and she couldn't help but share her unease with her husband, saying she noticed a man across the street who seemed to be spying on them every night. However, her husband said it was nothing to be alarmed about. At that moment, he was only concerned about the boss coming over for dinner that evening. But during dinner, he heard even more shocking news. A month ago in this very neighborhood, there was a woman who was murdered in her own home, and the manner of her death was identical to that of the woman last night. They speculated it was the work of the same killer. The people at the table treated it as a joke, but Juliet once again felt a strong sense of unease. The case quickly made the front page of the newspaper, which published the victim's name. Juliet followed up on the name and discovered that this was indeed a serial case. There were already 4 victims, all of whom were young and beautiful, and the killer seemed to be driven purely by a perverse desire to kill. Fortunately, one woman survived. During an interview, she recounted the situation at the time, but there was one part that sent chills down Juliet's spine.
I think he was watching me before. I just had a sense that someone was always behind me, even when I was alone.
At that moment, Juliet also felt a shadow behind her. She hesitated and slowed down, but the man sped up and caught up with her. At this point, Juliet finally breathed a sigh of relief, thinking perhaps she had just been too sensitive lately. So, she decided to watch a movie to relax. There were only a few people scattered in the theater. Juliet chose a seat where no one was around, but shortly after she sat down, a man sat behind her, seemingly having chosen that spot on purpose. Waves of fear suddenly surged up in Juliet, and she dared to take a look. The man slowly moved closer to her. Unable to suppress her fear any longer, she quickly got up and ran away. As she fled, she glanced back at the man's silhouette. Instinctively, she headed towards a crowded area and entered a supermarket. Just as she began to relax, she noticed the man furtively glancing at her from a distance. Juliet quickly moved forward, using the shelves to block the man's view, but soon after, the man followed her. She turned her head carefully to check, only to find that the man's shoes were exactly the same as the man in the theater. Juliet, coming to her senses, hurriedly fled, but even after returning home she was still shaken. After absent-mindedly listening to her husband tell some uninteresting jokes, she recounted today's ordeal to him. Her husband merely said he would protect her, but this did little to ease Juliet's anxiety. So her husband decided to take her to check the supermarket's surveillance footage. The footage was exactly like what happened today, finally freezing on the image of the man looking at her. Juliet thought this would be enough to prove her suspicions, but her husband didn't find anything unusual about it. Hearing her husband say this, Juliet didn't say anything further. She just took a picture of the man's profile from the surveillance footage, but it was too blurry to clearly see the man's features. Juliet decided to stay by the window to look for that figure, but from day to night, no similar figure appeared. So she bravely hid behind the curtain to check the opposite window, but the man, as if knowing everything, did not show up. Just as she was staring blankly at the dark window, the door behind her suddenly knocked. Then the knocking became more urgent. He peeked through the peephole and opened the door. The old lady from downstairs spoke anxiously, but Juliet didn't understand the local language. Then, the neighbor returned. She translated that the old lady's cat was missing and asked Juliet if she saw it.
I'm sorry, I haven't seen it.
Only then did the old lady leave with a look of regret. Juliet finally relaxed a bit, and the woman next door warmly invited her for a drink and a chat. After chatting for a while, the two became more familiar with each other. Juliet couldn't help but ask Lena if she ever felt like there were eyes watching them from across the way. But obviously, Lena didn't care about these things, because the gun in the drawer was enough for her self-defense. After a few drinks, Juliet was slightly tipsy and temporarily put her unease at the back of her mind. But shortly after lying down at home, she thought of the man outside the window again. Taking advantage of her drunkenness, she simply opened the curtains. Sure enough, the man across the way was standing at the window, and his outline seemed to become clearer. But he suddenly felt that perhaps the man wasn't really looking at him. So he tentatively waved at the man, but there was no response. However, just as he was laughing at his own foolish action, the man across the way actually responded. This instantly sobered Juliet up completely. When her husband returned, she quickly told him about what had just happened. But when he went to the window to check, he didn't see the man his wife described, and Juliet decided to call the police. The police arrived quickly, and Juliet recounted all the strange events that had occurred over the past few days, and showed them the photos taken from the surveillance. But the police seemed somewhat skeptical. But clearly the police were not satisfied with her explanation, yet they decided to go across the street to take a look. Juliet kept pacing back and forth, unsure of what the outcome would be. But when her husband returned, he was somewhat impatient. She said that even if it's the same man, it's normal for him to live here and go to the same supermarket. This was something Juliet found hard to accept.
You should stop rationalizing this all away.
You want me to stop being rational and just jump to the craziest conclusion like you? Do you think I'm crazy?
Her husband explained that maybe he was just too stressed from always being home alone, but Juliet had enough of his pretentious analysis. She just wanted to move out as soon as possible. Then the two of them got into an argument, which ended on a sour note. The next morning, Juliet walked down the street feeling despondent. She had been so tormented by anxiety that she had lost all the elegance she had when she first moved in. But just as she reached the corner, she saw that man again. She quickly followed him, but noticed nothing unusual along the way. It wasn't until she followed the man into a bar that she discovered he was the cleaner there. And just as she was staring at the man in a daze, hush. She ran into her neighbor Lena, who also worked there but had never noticed the cleaner man. After returning home, Juliet propped the door with a chair, as if that would make her feel a bit safer. But just as she was about to sleep, she discovered that the bed had been disturbed, and then someone covered her head. Out to be just a nightmare, but as soon as she calmed down, she heard sounds of fighting and screaming from next door. Juliet, in a panic, rushed to knock on the door. The knocking alarmed everyone, but when the landlord opened the door, they found it was just the old lady's missing cat that had knocked over the lamp. Juliet glanced around but couldn't find anything unusual, and Lena hadn't returned home. The next morning, she was still thinking about the situation from last night. She was worried that something might have happened to Lena when suddenly there was a rapid knocking in the hallway. A man was angrily pounding on Lena's door. It turned out that Lena had stood him up after work last night. But then, something strange happened. Juliet dialed Lena's phone number and the ringtone started playing in the room. However, she was sure that Lena hadn't come home last night because the soundproofing in the house wasn't good, and she had been listening intently for any noise from next door all night. Suddenly, she thought of something.
Wait.
Immediately after, the two appeared in the apartment building across the street. Juliet was worried that the peeping man had done something to Lena. After identifying the peeping man's room, Lena's boyfriend pounded on the door hard, but there seemed to be no one inside. Seeing this, her boyfriend left in a hurry, but Juliet did not give up. She bravely knocked on the door. The door was opened by an old man. Juliet quickly apologized and turned to leave, but just as she reached the stairway, that man suddenly appeared in front of her. She hurried into the elevator, and the man stood there staring at her intently. Juliet was so nervous she almost couldn't breathe. And that very night, the police suddenly came to her door, and surprisingly, the man was with them. It turned out that the man had called the police. Afterwards, Juliet went back to her room without saying a word. While she was lost in thought, her husband took out his phone. It turned out that the perpetrator of the serial case had been caught. It was the man they saw in the ambulance that day. He was a plumber who committed the crimes each time he went to work at someone's home. What her husband wanted to convey was that all of Juliet's fears were just her imagination. Juliet also began to wonder if it was really her own stress causing all this. Later they went together to attend a party at her husband's company, but Juliet still couldn't shake off the gloom. Just as she was trying to pull herself together and blend into the crowd, she overheard her husband turning her suspicions into gossip for his colleagues, which made Juliet extremely angry. Clearly, from beginning to end, her anxiety was nothing but a joke in her husband's eyes. Juliet angrily smashed a glass, but Nick caught up to complain that his wife couldn't take a joke, yet suddenly felt at a loss for words, only feeling deeply disappointed. Afterwards, she sat alone on the subway heading home. Looking at the empty carriage and the rambling homeless man, Juliet felt somewhat dazed, starting to wonder if this moment was real, or just an illusion. But suddenly, she felt as if someone was watching her from a distance, and what she saw next almost scared her out of her wits. In an instant, Juliet was so panicked that she didn't know what to do. She wanted to get off the train quickly, but the subway happened to malfunction, and the doors didn't open. She could only change her seat, hoping to block the man's view, but the footsteps in her ears grew closer. The man sat quietly across from her and started a conversation. Juliet tried hard to make herself look less scared. His words seemed to have a deeper meaning. Juliet couldn't hold back any longer and directly asked the man why he was following her. But the man's expression returned to normal, and he said that he spends all day taking care of his father, which makes his life dull and boring. That's why he often looks out the window at people, dreaming that a pretty girl might glance his way. Until that night when he saw Juliet waving, he mistakenly thought she was greeting him and responded. But Juliet was staring intently at the plastic bag beside the man, which seemed to reflect the image of a human face. She felt a chill run down her spine and the man's expression turned terrifying. Finally returned to the normal station, and Juliet hurriedly got off the train in a panic. After the man left with the subway, her nerves were nearly shattered, and she rushed home with a blank mind. She had to leave here immediately. But just as she finished packing some clothes, she heard music coming from Lena's room. Juliet hurried over to check, only to find that her door wasn't locked at all, and the entire room was engulfed in loud music. She slowly walked towards Lena's bedroom, but the scene before her scared her out of her wits. When Juliet regained consciousness, she instinctively shouted for help. But the man completely ignored her and smugly said that they could have caught her last night because she was hiding in the wardrobe nearby. But no one was willing to believe him. After saying that, he lifted the bag off Juliet's head. At that moment, there was a noise from the room next to Juliet's, followed by her husband's voice. Juliet wanted to call for help, but she couldn't make any sound. She clutched her throat and struggled to crawl towards the cabinet where Lena kept the gun, while the man leisurely followed behind her, knowing she couldn't escape. Just as she was a short distance from the drawer, Juliet ran out of strength and the man also lay down, until the light faded from his eyes. But at the moment she looked up, she noticed a girl at the opposite window staring in this direction, and her eyes immediately showed a fierce expression. But just as she was about to leave after tidying everything up, Juliet's phone rang. It was her husband from next door calling her, and upon hearing the ringtone, he finally sensed something was wrong. Just as he was about to go check, the man also walked out of Lena's room. He stood at the doorway covered in blood, while outside, startled dogs began to bark. At this point, the film ends. There were countless opportunities to avoid the tragedy, but Juliet's husband repeatedly dismissed her cries for help as mere imagination. No one knows what he was thinking the moment he saw his wife, or how they would face each other in the future. But for Juliet, perhaps in the future, she can only firmly believe that only she can save herself.